As you move from the thumbnail stage of your label design onto the computer to start building your design, some of the first choices you're going to have to make are regarding the fonts or the typefaces you choose to use. So I just want to go over some basics talking about type as you get to that stage in your design. Keep in mind it's not what you say, but how you say it. And for this, I put up the original Google logo at the top from the 1990s and then a redesign that they did a few years ago. And you can see they kept the color palette the same, but they went from what we consider a serif font to a sans serif font. And I'll talk more about those two styles of type in a second. But the question is, why would they make that change? Well, when we talk about some of the visual cues you give off by the fonts you choose, the choice will be a little obvious why they went that route. This has been a real trend over the last few years. A lot of companies have been changing their fonts, simplifying them, in many cases going to what we consider a sans serif font. And I'll talk more about that in a second here. But part of the reason is sans serif fonts, and again, as I mentioned, there's a lot of visual cues or visual shortcuts we use with the fonts we choose. And sans serif fonts tend to skew and appear a little bit more modern, a little bit more youthful, which is one of the reasons so many companies have gone that route with their logo designs. So basic categories. First up, we have serif. Serif fonts, serif refers to the little feet that you can see on some of the strokes of the letters. And here you can see a variety of different serif fonts. These are some of the oldest fonts in existence. These date all the way back to ancient Rome. And people always wonder, well, why were the little feet added to the strokes in here? And the best theory is, if you think of some of the earliest usages of these fonts, they were chiseled into monuments in architecture. And as a stonemason was chiseling, say, a vertical stroke, as they got to the end, it would have a really rough edge on it. And it didn't look good. And so they were trying to figure out how could we clean it up and give it a cleaner edge once you finish the stroke. And by rotating your chisel 90 degrees and just chiseling in a little horizontal foot on it, it gave it a nice clean edge. So that's the leading theory on where the serif fonts come from. For your purposes here, serif fonts tend to give off a feeling of being more classic, more sophisticated, a little bit more old-fashioned. And so that could be something you take into consideration if you do choose a serif font. So here's a serif font used in a label design as well. Sans serif fonts, it's basically just French for without serif. Sans means without, and without the serif. These were fonts that were developed in the 1800s, and they originally used primarily for advertising. And to polite society at the time, these sans serif fonts, these fonts without the feet on it, were considered kind of vulgar and actually grotesque. And actually, if you look through a lot of font lists, many sans serif fonts still are, as part of their name, are labeled as grotesques. Sans serif fonts are, as I mentioned earlier, very popular now. Sans serif fonts tend to appear a little bit more modern. They appear to skew a little bit more youthful. So if that's something you want to get across with your label design, that might be something you take into consideration with it. What's the difference between serif or sans serif, or for that matter, with uppercase capital letters or lowercase letters? Well, here's two bank logos. HSBC is a bank that primarily does business with other businesses. They are a business bank. And you can see they've chosen to go with serif fonts, which tend to be more classic, more old school, and also all capital letters, because again, their customers are other banks and other businesses. Now, Citibank on the bottom, Citibank is a bank that's more consumer facing. They are really trying to get business from everyday consumers. So you can see what they've done is they've gone with the sans serif font, but not only that, they've gone with the lowercase letters. Lowercase letters can appear a little bit more approachable, a little bit more friendly. So there you can see with two bank logos, different directions taken depending on who their customers are. Another category of type is script. This basically comes down into two categories. We have very formal script, and then we have more handwritten, kind of casual script. Here's some logos that you're familiar with that use the kind of script font. Here are examples of what we consider more formal scripts. Think what you would use on a wedding invitation. So here you can see it used in different logos for various companies. Here you can see really formal script used in a really beautiful wine label. Then there are the more kind of casual, we call these brush scripts. These are more kind of casual. They look more like handwriting. Probably one of the most famous, or the two most famous ones, would be the Coca-Cola or the Disney logos. And again, these can look a little bit more friendly. They can appear a little bit more approachable. And here you can see it done with the strawberry label as well. Another category we refer to is called display fonts. These tend to be the very, very decorative fonts. And the one thing you have to be a little careful of with display fonts, they can give you a lot of personality, but looking ahead to all the usages you may have to use for your type in your packaging, you may find it doesn't work well when you have to use a lot of it. So these tend to be the more very decorative, more kind of fonts from various time periods or styles. They can also be more kind of contemporary and techno, like you see here with the ice cream packaging. Then this kind of covers everything. This is custom fonts. And that's where what you do is you start with an existing font and then you go and you customize it for this particular usage. So if you look at the Tesla logo, my guess is they started with a very blocky sans serif font, and then they've customized it. And you can see they've rounded some of the edges, and then when it comes to the E and the A, they've done away with part of the vertical strokes to create a custom letter form there. Now, why would you customize type? Well, the biggest reason is ownability. And what that means is if I just do a Tesla logo with a regular font, it's really hard to copyright that and trademark because anyone could go and use the same font. But if I take that font and I customize it in such a way that it's unique to my company, then I can trademark it, I can copyright it. So even something as simple, if you look in the Lyft logo, the way they've done the linkage between the F and the T, we call that a ligature. Or even in the King logo, how they've kind of customized the K so that it sweeps around. As you're working on your packaging design, you might want to consider mixing and matching fonts. That's definitely something that you can do on here. Oftentimes you may want to start with a serif font and mix it with a sans serif or vice versa. Here you can see various company logos where they've mixed script fonts with serif or sans serif with script fonts as well. Here's an example of packaging design where you can see there's kind of vintage style fonts, but there's both serif and sans serif and script fonts on the packaging as well. More examples of that as well. So here you can see serif for Botanica, Eat Me with the script, and then Today is in the sans serif font. More examples. And again, especially if you're doing a vintage look, something that harks back to kind of Victorian design where mixing and matching fonts was a really big part of the design. Things to take into consideration too as you choose your type, and I mentioned this with the bank logos. Not only do you choose serif or sans serif fonts, but you'll also have the choice. Do you want to do all capital letters? Do you want to do all lowercase letters? Do you want to do what we call sentence case, where you have a capital letter and lowercase letters? So here's examples of logos done with all uppercase. Here's some examples of logos done with all lowercase. And again, for a lot of these, it has to do with who is your customer. Here's another bank logo for US Bank. It's consumer facing. They're trying to appear approachable and friendly, so they've gone with the kind of heavyweight lowercase sans serif fonts. You'll also, as you start looking through fonts, you'll notice with a lot of fonts you have options too as far as the scaling, meaning some fonts are very vertical and narrow. Some fonts are very horizontal and extended. And that can add to a really unique look to your label design. But keep in mind too, you don't want to paint yourself into a corner down the line somewhere. If you use very vertical type, that works great if you have a very vertical package. But if your package is actually more horizontal and you use vertical type, you might find it ends up looking way too small. Same thing happens if you use extended horizontal type. If you're on a very vertical package design or label design, the horizontal or the extended type may end up looking too small in the space. Here's examples of using packaging design with more of a narrow condensed font in there. You also have options in regards to the spacing of the letters. Here's an example with the FedEx logo where the letter spacing is so tight the letters are actually touching and overlapping. And then you have the Infinity logo where the letters have actually been spaced out. That's another one of the visual clues or visual cues we use in design too. Something about letter spacing words out tends to make them look a little bit more sophisticated. And for packaging design, it could also be a little clue that you consider this more expensive or a higher quality. So playing around with the letter spacing may be something you want to consider as well. Here's, again, some spirit labeling, and you can see just kind of simple how the letter spacing has been pulled out a little bit more. And then finally, when we talk about fonts, I'm just going to leave you with these two rules. In this class, anyone who uses Papyrus or Comic Sans, I will fail your project. All right? These are two fonts among designers which are universally reviled. And if you have them in your portfolio, you're going to be setting yourself up for failure. So you're free to use whatever fonts you want other than these two.